In response to e4, e6 turns the game into the French defense, preparing to strike in the center with d5. White is granted a space advantage in the center after d4. When black counterattacks white's center with d5, white has a variety of choices to consider. We're going to examine white's most ambitious and popular choice, knight c3, supporting the e4 pawn while adding pressure against black's center. D takes e4 is known as the Rubinstein variation, which leads to slightly passive but relatively solid play for black. Black's most popular responses are knight f6, which we'll later examine, or the more aggressive bishop b4, known as the winnower variation. Black pins the knight, threatening d takes e4. White has a variety of sidelines that can be explored, including simplifying the game with e takes d5. The most challenging as well as popular response is to resolve the central tension and grab space with e5. The e5 pawn discourages knight f6, restricting the knight's most active option to enter the game. White enjoys a central space advantage, so black should energetically counterattack white's center. Two candidate pawn breaks are c5 and f6. Since the d4 pawn is not protected by another pawn, this is a great square to target, starting with c5. Black is trying to undermine white's center because if the d4 pawn falls, the e5 pawn will become vulnerable to attack. White can address this issue by confronting black's bishop with a3. If black counterattacks white's knight with c takes d4, white will be happy to claim the bishop pair with a takes b4, leading to comfortable play for white. Bishop a5 is a sideline known as the Armenian variation. White has two strong responses, b4, unpinning the knight, and preparing the unpleasant knight b5, eyeing the weak d6 square. Queen g4, just like the mainline variation we're about to examine, places serious pressure against black's position. In response to a3, the mainline response is to initiate the exchange bishop takes c3 check, b takes c3. We have reached a strategically rich position filled with imbalances. White enjoys a space advantage as well as the bishop pair, a potential long-term positional asset, especially if the position begins to open. Currently, white's dark-squared bishop is quite restricted by the central pawn chain, so white may try to activate it with a4 and bishop a3, highlighting the weakened dark squares in black's position. White's light-squared bishop also enjoys less options based upon black's light-squared central structure. In exchange for the bishop pair, white's pawn structure has been compromised. Notice the isolated pawn on a3 and the doubled pawns on the c-file. These pawns can prove long-term liabilities for black to target, but notice the pawn on c3 supports d4, extending white's central pawn chain from c3 to e5, making it more difficult for black to break down white's central space advantage. The open b-file may also prove useful for white's major pieces to generate active play on the queen side. Black has to make a critical decision to try and keep the position closed, turning the game into a subtle positional maneuvering game, or else invite incredible complications in order to provoke active counterplay. An important sideline to explore is queen a5. This is the so-called Portish hook variation. The early queen move threatens the unprotected c3 pawn, forking the king and rook, preparing to meet bishop d2, defending the pawn and suggesting a possible c4 discovered attack against the queen, with queen a4, adding pressure against both the d4 and c2 pawns. This approach often prepares to resolve the central tension with c4, restricting white's bishop pair. White's most aggressive response is queen g4, when black can either forfeit the right to castle with king f8, certainly not the end of the world in such a closed position, or accept dark square weaknesses on the king side with g6. This is a line definitely worth exploring, and white may also consider a more subtle approach with queen b1, taking advantage of the open lines on the b-file, and black should not overlook the threat of bishop b5 check, forking the king and queen. This allows black to close the position with c4. The closed nature of the position makes it difficult for either side to generate dangerous attacks early in the game. Since the center remains closed, both kings are under less pressure to commit to castling. White may decide to grab space on the king side with h4, or follow in the footsteps of Grandmaster Wang Hao with knight e2. Moving the knight to e2 may appear a bit strange at first sight, but we'll soon understand what white has in mind. If black would like to provoke complications on the king side, then the pawn break f6 is worth exploring. But Grandmaster Vasily Ivanchuk, playing black, preferred to keep the position closed with knight c6. White's knight eyes the kingside and eventually the vulnerable g7 pawn, a typical weakness in the winnower, with knight f4. Grandmaster Ivanchuk developed his other knight with knight g to e7, preparing to meet knight h5, attacking the g7 pawn with rook g8. Black avoids making any weaknesses on the kingside and signals a likely plan to castle queenside. The knight on h5 does an excellent job restricting black's kingside activity as it adds pressure to g7 and also discourages an f6 pawn break. White completes his kingside development starting with g3, preparing to activate the light-squared bishop. Grandmaster Ivanchuk played bishop d7, preparing to castle on the queenside. White should not be tempted to grab a pawn with queen takes b7, as this runs into trouble after rook b8, taking over the open b file and forcing queen c7. Black could force a draw with rook c8, but rather than repeating moves, a strong response is to play queen takes c2, invading White's territory when White will have a difficult time castling without losing the dark-squared bishop. This turns out to be the least of White's concerns, because after bishop g2, Black has the powerful move queen b2, threatening the rook on a1 while supporting the rook on b8. This means that after White plays king e2, connecting the rooks while still defending the dark-squared bishop, White's wayward queen is in serious trouble after rook b7. If the queen tries to escape with queen d6, not only does Black have the powerful shot knight takes d4 check, preparing to meet c takes d4 with c3, attacking the pinned bishop, Black may also play knight f5, attacking the enemy queen, which runs out of squares after queen c5. Black has no shortage of crushing moves, but the simplest option is to chase down the queen with rook b5, when White's queen has run out of safe squares. Grandmaster Wang Hao did not fall for this trap and continued with his plan of kingside development with bishop h3. This extended fianchetto adds pressure against the e6 pawn, when both sides decided to castle. Grandmaster Ivanchuk spent a tempo to place his king on b8. This move anticipates White's potential idea of queen b2, followed by placing a rook on b1, threatening checkmate on b7. Now that the c8 square is clear, Black can play bishop c8, defending the b7 pawn, or as Black played in the game, rook c8, preparing rook c7. Black's strategy to build a central blockade results in serious maneuvering struggles in which Black remains relatively solid, but White does enjoy reasonable chances to build an initiative based upon the open lines on the b file, as well as the eventual pawn break of f4 and f5. In this particular encounter, White was able to break through and win the game. Queen a5 sets the stage for a more strategic, maneuvering battle. If Black is in the mood to provoke a sharp middle game struggle, then Black may decide to play knight e7. If White plays a natural developing move such as knight f3, not only can Black consider queen a5, another interesting choice is b6, preparing to exchange Black's light-squared bishop for its more active counterpart with bishop a6. The flank pawn moves a4, preparing bishop a3, as well as the ultra-aggressive h4, a somewhat trendy option that intends to grab more space and provoke weaknesses on the king side with h5, and if allowed, h6, should both be taken seriously. One option to explore against both of these flank pawn moves is queen a5, with similar ideas to the queen a5 lines we discussed earlier. White's most principled and challenging option is to take advantage of Black's vulnerable king side with queen g4, directly challenging Black's unprotected g7 pawn, a consequence of activating the winnower dark-squared bishop so early in the game. This is a critical moment in the opening, as Black's response defines the middle game struggle. Defending the g7 pawn with knight f5 is not a popular choice, as White can play bishop d3, attacking the knight, provoking additional kingside weaknesses in order to avoid an immediate loss of material. King f8 is a surprising way to defend the pawn, and may even look like a mouse slip, although it does forfeit castling rights. Accepting a somewhat awkward, passive position, it's actually not so easy to break down if Black remains patient. A far more popular king move is to castle directly into the storm. This historic mainline option has been put under serious pressure, as White enjoys dangerous kingside attacking chances. All of these choices respect White's opening initiative, preparing to defend before looking for counterattacking chances. A completely different approach is to fight fire with fire, either by first playing c takes d4, or directly playing queen c7. turning the game into the razor-sharp poison pawn variation. This subtle queen move applies pressure against white's advanced e5 pawn, as well as x-raying the unprotected pawn on c3. White is invited to ravage black's kingside with queen takes g7, capturing a pawn while attacking the unprotected rook, forcing the response rook g8. Black's rook counterattacks white's queen, allowing white to grab another pawn with queen takes h7. White is currently up 2 pawns, and the newly passed h-pawn is especially dangerous. White will seek to advance the passed pawn, trying to punish black's carefree attitude on the kingside. That being said, by sacrificing 2 pawns on the kingside, the g and h files are now open, so black's major pieces may try to use these open files for counterplay. We shouldn't forget that in order to accept black's pawns, white's queen is the only developed piece, so white's position remains vulnerable to counterattack. Black must act quickly and create counterplay before white comfortably completes development, so it's essential to play c takes d4. Capturing this pawn reveals the queen's attack against the c3 pawn, threatening to fork the king and rook. The e5 pawn is also hanging with check, highlighting the strength of black's subtle queen move. World champion Michal Tal experimented with king d1, avoiding the deadly fork on c3 while preserving the option of developing the knight to the more active f3 square, but this committal king move has not attracted many followers. White's main response is the strange-looking knight e2, supporting the c3 square while attacking the d4 pawn. Queen takes e5 is no longer with check and would be a serious mistake, as white can improve the pawn structure with c takes d4, gaining a tempo against the queen. White's knight also supports bishop f4 when white's pieces come to life, exactly what black wants to avoid. There is nothing wrong with playing d takes c3 immediately, but sometimes black prefers to first play the tricky knight b to c6, supporting black's pawn on d4 while also attacking the e5 pawn. This move sets up a small trap if white decides to play c takes d4. It looks like black is in serious trouble as white has corrected the pawn structure while reinforcing the e5 stronghold, but white is in for a rude awakening after knight takes d4. Suddenly knight takes c2 check is a serious threat, and if white makes the mistake of capturing the knight, this allows the nice tactical shot, queen c3 check, forking the king, rook, and knight on d4, so white is in serious trouble. Rather than falling for the trap, white can reinforce the center with f4. When after the typical d takes c3, white may capture the c3 pawn immediately, leading to interesting play, but white's most common continuation is queen d3, centralizing the queen, adding pressure against the c3 pawn, while also clearing the path for the h-pawn to march up the board. The modern pawn sacrifice d4 has been black's most trusted resource, leading to forcing, concrete play. The classical response is to focus on development with bishop d7, possibly preparing queenside castling. When after knight takes c3, the unpleasant knight b5 is in the air, so black should prevent this idea with a6. If white decides to march the h-pawn up the board, then knight f5 and queenside castling is likely in black's future. We should note that if white plays rook b1, taking advantage of the semi-open b-file sets the stage for an instructive trap. Black has no shortage of interesting ideas, including knight a5, preparing to post itself on the c4 square. Knight f5 is a sensible move, and black may decide to keep the king in the center for the time being with rook c8, preparing to create dangerous counterplay down the c-file. One thing is certainly clear, black should not castle at this exact moment, as white has the surprising resource queen takes a6. Thanks to the rook on b1, opening up the b-file with b takes a6 allows bishop takes a6 check, when black is forced to surrender the queen with queen b7, leading to an overwhelming advantage for white. The poison pawn variation sets the stage for a sharp struggle in which both sides must tread carefully, as a single slip can spell absolute disaster. The winnower variation with bishop b4 often creates early imbalances with bishop takes c3, leading to sharp play with mutual chances. D takes e4 is known as the Rubinstein variation, known for its solid, somewhat passive play. A popular middle ground option is knight f6, immediately challenging white's center. This is a provocative move, inviting white to grab space and gain a tempo against the knight with e5, known as the Steinitz variation. The knight typically retreats to the d7 square. Your first impression may suggest this does not look like a great square for the knight, and there's certainly some point to that thought, but it does add pressure against white's advanced e5 pawn, which may later help prepare the thematic French pawn break f6. The knight also supports the other thematic French pawn break, c5, while also eyeing the b6 square to help fight for queenside control. The knight on d7 is a bit awkwardly placed, but we should also mention it is not alone. White's knight on c3 isn't ideally placed to deal with black's pawn break c5, attacking the d4 pawn, when white would like to reinforce this pawn with c3. White sometimes plays the strange-looking knight c to e2, preparing to meet c5 with c3. Although we are generally advised not to move the f-pawn too early, in this case white's most popular response is f4, reinforcing the e5 pawn while increasing white's space advantage. This sets the stage for a future f5 pawn break, which may help support a kingside attack. The struggle for the center intensifies as both sides focus on the d4 pawn with c5, attacking the pawn while seizing queenside space, so white sensibly reinforces the pawn with knight f3, preparing to meet the natural knight c6, with bishop e3. White has stabilized the center for the time being, when black must commit to a particular path. Releasing the tension with c takes d4, preparing to activate the dark-squared bishop with bishop c5 is a classical option worth exploring. Intensifying the pressure against the center and b2 pawn with queen b6 is a provocative option, leading to concrete play after knight a4, allowing black to play an interesting check with queen a5. Developing modestly with bishop e7, contemplating kingside castling is a solid choice. Since white enjoys a central and kingside space advantage, another popular path to explore is a6, preparing to generate counterplay on the queen side. A useful move for white is queen d2, centralizing the queen while clearing the path for a future rook d1. This move may also allow a future queen f2, eyeing both the king side as well as adding additional pressure against the c5 pawn. Black's queenside expansion continues with b5, dreaming of advancing to b4, gaining a tempo against the knight, followed by a5 and bishop a6, resolving black's so-called bad bishop problem. If black is able to play b4, this eliminates the knight's protection of e4. So black may try to engineer a future c takes d4, clearing the c5 square for the maneuver knight c5 to e4. White has no shortage of interesting choices. The most popular of these options include releasing the tension with d takes c5, preparing a dark square blockade with knight e2 to d4. White may also decide to maintain the tension with a3, discouraging an immediate b4 and remaining flexible based upon how black decides to continue. The interested viewer can explore the straightforward bishop b7, or the more energetic queen moves queen b6, continuing the struggle over the center, or queen a5, taking advantage of the pinned a3 pawn, renewing the positional threat b4. The Steinitz variation can lead to early simplifications if either side resolves the tension between the d4 and c5 pawns, but it can also be filled with tension, as is the case here, with plenty of interesting play for both sides. The Steinitz variation with e5 is a challenging option, clamping down against black's position. Another popular path is to maintain the tension in the center with bishop g5, pinning the f6 knight and threatening to advance the e-pawn forward. Black has several ways to deal with this threat, including d takes e4, turning the game into the Byrne variation, which has similarities to the Rubinstein variation we mentioned as a third move alternative. The counterattacking bishop b4, known as the McCutcheon variation, shares certain similarities with the winnower. Or black may decide to enter the classical variation with the straightforward bishop e7, unpinning the knight, renewing the threat against the e4 pawn, provoking the pawn advance e5. Once again we see black's knight retreat to the d7 square, building tension against white's center while offering an exchange of dark-squared bishops. We can see a similar theme to the Steinitz variation if white continues with bishop takes e7, preparing to meet queen takes e7 with the space-gaining f4, a popular option worth investigating. If white wants to sharpen the game, then a strong resource is h4. Known as the Alekhine-Chittard attack, black is by no means obligated to accept this pawn sacrifice and may prefer to counterattack in the center with knight c6, the thematic pawn break c5, question the bishop with h6. Castling is quite risky, inviting white to create a dangerous kingside attack. if black decides to play bishop takes g5, h takes g5, white's rook becomes incredibly active on the h-file without having to move. The sacrifice is accepted with queen takes g5. White has a variety of interesting options to explore, including queen d3, adding pressure against the h7 pawn, attacking the c7 pawn with knight b5, preparing to meet queen d8, with queen g4 as a dynamic option worth keeping in mind. But white's most common path historically has been knight h3. The knight does not obstruct white's queen on the d1 to h5 diagonal, so after queen e7, white may first activate the knight with knight f4, or immediately play queen g4, attacking black's unprotected g7 pawn, provoking kingside weaknesses. This is a dangerous gambit with serious dynamic potential, so white enjoys full compensation for the pawn. Defending the e4 pawn while adding serious pressure against black's center with knight c3 is white's most active approach against the French defense. Black's most popular continuations include bishop b4, known as the winnower variation, provoking positional imbalances with the potential for sharp play. Knight f6 is also worth considering, allowing white to either pin the knight with bishop g5, or gain a space advantage with e5, known as the Steinitz variation. White generally enjoys a space advantage, affording more active piece play, but this is not a one-sided advantage. Black has plenty of counterattacking chances, leading to a rich, imbalanced middle game struggle filled with interesting possibilities for both sides to discover. Thanks for exploring the knight c3 variations in the French defense, and best of luck the next time you decide to attack or defend the French defense.